30 American soldiers stand in a muddy field in France. In 1 hour, they'll watch a fellow soldier hang for a reason they're never told. This 21-year-old black soldier's name is Private James Hendricks, and his family will never know what happened to him. It's the story of 70 executions and the telegram that told James Hendricks' family their son died of willful misconduct without ever mentioning the gallows. The numbers tell part of the story. Between 1943 and 1946, the United States Army executed 70 soldiers in the European theater for capital crimes committed against civilians. 55 of them were black. That's 79%. In an army that was 8.5% African American. Let that sink in. A black soldier in Europe was more than 10 times more likely to hang than a white one who committed the same crimes. But statistics don't capture what Louis-Guillou saw. Guillou was a French novelist, a resistance fighter who spoke perfect English and had translated works by Harlem Renaissance writers. In the summer of 1944, freshly liberated Brittany needed interpreters for American military courts. Guillou took the job. What he witnessed would haunt him for 30 years before he could write about it. James Hendricks arrived in Europe carrying the weight of Camp Van Dorn, Mississippi. That name meant something to black soldiers in World War II. Van Dorn was where the army sent troublemakers, which meant black units that demanded to be treated like human beings. The camp's commanding officers were known to draw their pistols and shoot at soldiers' feet to make them look lively. At any given time, 65 to 85 black soldiers sat in the stockade for infractions like missing a button or protesting when an officer kicked them. Hendricks was a truck driver in the 3326th Quartermaster Truck Company, not a combat soldier, not even close to the front lines. Just a kid from North Carolina who drove supplies through liberated France while white officers commanded segregated units, and French civilians tried to understand how their liberators could treat some of their own soldiers with such visible contempt. The crime happened in August 1944. Hendricks had been drinking. Calvados or cognac, probably. Strong stuff that the Normandy farmers made, and American soldiers discovered too late, was stronger than anything back home. According to his own confession to his commanding officer, Hendricks went looking for companionship that night. He knocked on farmhouse doors. When one family wouldn't open up, he shouted, "Ouvrir, mademoiselle," and fired his M1 rifle through the wooden door, twice. Behind that door stood Victor Baignon, a decorated World War I veteran, a respected farmer who sat on the Plumadon Town Council, a father. The bullets killed him instantly. When the door opened, Hendricks panicked. He fled to a nearby farm where he assaulted Bignon's widow, who had run there for help. The army arrested him immediately. The trial took place in Morlaix, a town 30 miles east of Brest. It lasted 2 days. Hendricks was defended by a young officer with no experience in criminal defense, much less capital murder trials. The prosecution was led by Lieutenant Joseph Green, who understood perfectly what General George Patton's August memo meant. Patton had written that he was gravely concerned with the increasing number of crimes of violence against French civilians, and ordered that the death penalty would be applied in cases of rape. What Patton called undue command influence wouldn't become illegal until after the war. In 1944, it was standard practice. Officers understood that seeking the death penalty wherever possible was what the brass wanted, and the brass got it. Louis-Guillou sat in that courtroom translating testimony from French civilians into English. He watched the all-white military tribunal. He watched the young defense attorney struggle. He watched Green expertly link the killing of Victor Bignon with the assault charge, creating a felony murder case that demanded execution. The trial was thorough in procedure, brutal in outcome. But what Guillou couldn't stop thinking about was the comparison that was coming. A few weeks after Hendricks' trial, Guillou returned to the same courtroom in Morlaix. Same chairs, same officers, but this time, the defendant sitting at the table was Captain George Whittington, white, 24 years old. A genuine war hero with the Army's second highest decoration, the Distinguished Service Cross. Whittington had led his men up the cliffs at Omaha Beach on D-Day. His heroism was captured in Cornelius Ryan's book The Longest Day, and later in the film. Whittington's crime? He shot and killed Francis Morand, a French resistance fighter and paratrooper, outside a bar in Les Neven. The two had been drinking together. They got into an argument. Whittington shot him in an open courtyard, in the face, point blank. A cold-blooded murder of a resistance fighter, as one witness described it. But Whittington had advantages Hendricks never dreamed of. His brother was an officer serving with British Field Marshal Montgomery. He flew in to help. Whittington's defense attorney was the same Lieutenant Joseph Green, who had prosecuted Hendricks so effectively. Turns out Green was brilliant at defense work too, when the defendant had the right skin color. Green's defense was ingenious. He argued that Morand might have been a spy, that his French identity was uncertain, that Whittington, a combat-tested officer who had faced the Germans at Omaha Beach, had acted in self-defense against a potentially dangerous individual. The court bought it. Every word. Whittington was acquitted. He returned home to Kentucky, became a community leader, a philanthropist. In the 1960s, he even took a courageous stand for integration and civil rights. Meanwhile, James Hendricks sat in a guardhouse in Saint-Fouguet, Western Brittany, waiting to die. Lieutenant Robert Saunders visited him daily. Saunders was one of the Army's few black Baptist chaplains, a 40-year-old minister who had served at Camp Van Dorn alongside Hendricks back in 1943. Saunders knew exactly what life had been like for Hendricks in the segregated army. The conditions at Van Dorn had so appalled him that he'd tried to resign his commission, but the army didn't accept resignations from black chaplains who saw too much. On Thanksgiving Day 1943, Saunders and Hendricks prayed together in the guardhouse. The next morning, they would pray again on the gallows. The execution orders specified everything. Château La Vallée, a 14th-century manor house in Ploumodon, deserted for years with rickety stone walls and gaping holes where windows had been. The courtyard was the size of a baseball field, perfect for an execution. The citizens of Ploumodon were to be informed, but official attendance was limited to authorities designated by the American Army. No photographs. The local press was ordered to omit the condemned man's name and unit from any articles. But 30 American soldiers from units across Brittany and Normandy received orders for temporary duty in Ploumodon. They arrived that Friday morning not knowing what they were there for. The commanding officer arranged them in the courtyard, some designated as official witnesses, others as authorized spectators. Then he told them, in 1 hour, an American soldier was going to hang. This wasn't war. This was theater, a spectacle designed to send a message to black troops and French civilians alike. The army hadn't just decided to execute James Hendricks. They decided to make an example of him. November 24th, 1944, was cold and grey and wet, the kind of morning that goes straight to your bones. At 10:59 a.m., a 2.5-ton army truck arrived in the courtyard. James Hendricks stepped out, escorted by 2 guards and 4 officers. He wore his uniform, but the jacket had been stripped of its insignia. The modest markings that identified him as a private first class in the quartermaster battalion, gone. He was nobody now. A Graves registration sergeant who witnessed 16 of these public hangings would later tell a researcher, "It was old KKK procedure. It was a legal lynch." Hendricks walked to the gallows with Lieutenant Saunders beside him. The black chaplain had stayed with this kid through everything, from the brutality of Camp Van Dorn to the mockery of justice in Morlaix to this moment in the rain. Saunders read from scripture. Hendricks listened. His face was described as gentle, his eyes soft despite what he'd done and what was about to happen to him. The protocol was rigid. Military precision applied to state-sanctioned vengeance. Saunders asked the required question. "Do you have a statement to make to me as chaplain?" Hendricks's last words were simple. "Thank you for what you've did for me. Tell all the boys not to do what I did." The commandant gave the signal. The trap door opened. 21 years old, North Carolina, truck driver, dead. His body was buried nearby, then later moved. In 1949, the Army reinterred James Hendricks in Plot E of the Oise-Aisne American Cemetery, about 75 miles east of Paris. You won't find Plot E on any tour. It's hidden, deliberately. separated from the main cemetery plots by hedges and thick forest. An oval-shaped clearing, 100 by 50 feet, holding 96 graves. The army calls them the dishonorable dead. Every one of them was dishonorably discharged just before execution. Their graves are marked only with numbers. No names, no crosses, just stones with numbers carved into them. James Hendricks is number 73. His family received a telegram. Your son died as a result of his own willful misconduct. No explanation. No details. No mention of France or a trial or a gallows. Just willful misconduct. His adopted family in North Carolina spent decades wondering what happened. Had he died in combat? In an accident? From disease? They tried to find answers. The army stonewalled every inquiry. The execution records were sealed. His file was marked confidential. James Hendricks' family would not learn the truth until the 21st century, when historian Alice Kaplan finally tracked them down while researching her book, The Interpreter. No American has been to visit me since 1944, Jeanine Bignon, Victor Bignon's daughter, told Kaplan 60 years after her father's death. The Bignon family didn't know what happened at that trial either. They didn't know about the statistics, or the patterns, or the systematic racism baked into every level of army justice. They just knew their father was dead, and someone had been executed for it, and they'd been forgotten. Everyone had been forgotten, except Louis Guillou. The French interpreter couldn't forget what he'd seen. 2 trigger-happy, drunken soldiers who killed men in France. 2 trials in the same courtroom. 1 black private hanged. 1 white captain acquitted. Guillou thought about it for 20 years before he started writing. It took him 12 years and countless drafts to turn his memories into a novel. He called it OK, Joe, and published it in French. The novel concentrated on 2 cases. The black private James Hendricks, condemned to hang at Ploumodon, and the white officer George Whittington, whom the army found innocent. Guillou's novel was fiction, but everyone who knew about the trials recognized the truth underneath. But James Hendricks' story is part of something even bigger than one man's execution. It connects directly to perhaps the most famous lynching in American history. 10 years after James Hendricks swung from that gallows in France, another telegram arrived at another black family's home in Chicago, July 1945. Your husband died as a result of his own willful misconduct. Same words. Same vague, bureaucratic cruelty. Same sealed files. The telegram went to Mamie Till. Her husband, Private Louis Till, had been court-martialed in Italy and hanged on July 2, 1945, convicted of assault and murder. His body went to the same hidden cemetery as James Hendricks. Plot E. Another stone marked only with a number. Another family told nothing except willful misconduct. The army sent Louis Till's belongings home. Among them was a silver ring engraved with his initials. L.T. Mamie gave the ring to their son. The boy wore it throughout his childhood, asking questions about the father he never knew, questions his mother couldn't answer because the army refused to tell her anything. In 1955, 14-year-old Emmett Till traveled to Mississippi to visit relatives. He wore his father's ring. He allegedly whistled at a white woman in a grocery store. 2 white men dragged him from his great-uncle's house in the middle of the night, tortured him, shot him, and threw his body in the Tallahatchie River. When they pulled Emmett Till's mutilated body from that river, authorities identified him by his father's ring, LT, the initials of a man executed by his own army on the finger of a boy lynched by white supremacists. Father and son, both killed for allegedly threatening white women. Father and son both denied justice, and here's where it gets even worse. During the trial of Emmett Till's murderers, Mississippi Senators James Eastland and John Stennis used their positions to obtain Louis Till's confidential military file. They leaked it to segregationist newspapers. Northern papers had portrayed Louis Till as a soldier who died serving his country. The leaked files revealed he'd been executed for assaulting Italian women. The Mississippi grand jury immediately refused to indict Emmett Till's killers for kidnapping, even though both men had admitted in sworn testimony that they abducted the boy. The revelation that Emmett's father had been convicted, as one writer put it erased the possibility that the killers would be punished for any crime whatsoever. The sins of the father. Blood guilt. In Mississippi's eyes, a 14-year-old boy deserved to die because his executed father's record justified every racist assumption about black sexuality and violence. Never mind that Louis Till's trial, like James Hendricks, was conducted by an all-white military court in a segregated army. Never mind that the evidence was thin, the defense inadequate, the outcomes predetermined by the color of the defendant's skin. The pattern was clear. The statistics were undeniable. Of the 70 men executed by the army in Europe, 55 were black. Of the 29 executed specifically for assault charges, 25 were black. No white soldier was executed for assault alone, not one. The segregated army of 1944 had created two parallel systems of justice. When a black soldier in a service unit stood accused, the prosecution was aggressive, the defense was inexperienced, and the verdict was foreordained. When a white officer with combat decorations faced similar charges, suddenly everyone discovered reasonable doubt, questions of evidence, the possibility of self-defense. General Patton's command influence memo ensured that officers understood what was expected. Seek the death penalty. Make examples. Protect the Army's reputation with the French by appearing to take civilian deaths seriously. And if that meant executing black soldiers at 10 times the rate of white soldiers, well, that was just how things worked in a Jim Crow army. The French noticed. When American soldiers were hanged in their villages, locals witnessed who lived and who died. A white Graves registration sergeant who attended 16 executions couldn't get over it decades later. Old KKK procedure, he said. Legal lynching. French Mayor Omer Carroll reported rumors after one incident. Anywhere from 1 to 50 men killed, he told army investigators. The rumors were about Camp Van Dorn, where James Hendricks had trained, where black soldiers were routinely brutalized by their own officers, where Private William Walker was shot in the head by a local sheriff for having a button missing from his uniform. The mysteries pile up. Over 800 soldiers disappeared from the 364th Infantry Regiment's roster between 1943 and 1945. The Army says they can all be accounted for. The families aren't so sure. The records are inconsistent. The explanations are vague. And the pattern of how black soldiers were treated makes it hard to take official reassurances at face value. But back to James Hendricks. Because his story, isolated as it seems, represents everything that was wrong with military justice in World War II. He committed a serious crime. Let's be clear about that. James Hendricks, drunk and reckless, fired his rifle through a door and killed an innocent man. Then he assaulted that man's widow. Those are facts. He was guilty. But guilt isn't the question here. The question is whether he received justice. His trial lasted 2 days. His defense attorney had no experience with capital cases. The prosecutor expertly framed the charges to mandate execution. The all-white tribunal delivered the expected verdict. The review process, which was supposed to ensure fairness, rubber-stamped the death sentence. And General Eisenhower personally approved James Hendricks' execution, along with dozens of others. Meanwhile, Captain Whittington shot a French resistance fighter in cold blood and walked free. Same crime, same courtroom, different outcome. The only variable that mattered was skin color. The Army reformed its military justice system after the war. They established the Court of Military Appeals. They recognized that command influence created unjust outcomes. They acknowledged, quietly, that something had gone terribly wrong in those courtrooms in France. But they never acknowledged the racial dimension. They never apologized to the families who received telegrams about willful misconduct. They never explained why 79% of executed soldiers were black. And they sure as hell never explained Plot E, that hidden cemetery with its numbered stones. 96 American soldiers buried in shame, separated from the honored dead, hidden in the trees so visitors to the main cemetery won't accidentally stumble across them. The Army calls it necessary. Can't have the dishonorably discharged buried among the heroes. Can't have families visiting graves of rapists and murderers alongside the men who stormed Omaha Beach. But here's what the army won't say. 55 of those 96 graves hold black soldiers. In an army that was 8.5% black. Do the math. Those aren't random statistics. That's systematic racial injustice, carried across the Atlantic, administered through military courts, and buried in a hidden plot in France. The families of these men deserved better. James Hendricks's family deserved to know what happened to their son. They deserved to know where he was buried. They deserved the truth, not a vague telegram about misconduct, but the army determined that shame was inheritable. If you were executed, your family didn't deserve to know the details. They didn't deserve to visit your grave. They didn't deserve closure. Emmett Till learned about her husband's execution the same way everyone else did, when Mississippi senators leaked his confidential file to destroy her son's memory. Alice Kaplan had to track down Hendricks's family 60 years later to tell them what really happened. 60 years of wondering. 60 years of lies by omission. This is what institutional racism looks like. It's not just individual prejudice. It's not just officers using slurs or treating black soldiers with contempt. It's a system that takes individual bias and multiplies it through every level of authority. It's prosecutors who seek death for black defendants and plea deals for white ones. It's defense attorneys who try harder for officers than for truck drivers. It's review boards that find reasonable doubt for white defendants and none for black ones. It's generals who approve execution after execution without questioning why they're almost all signing death warrants for black soldiers. And it's a country that let it happen, that trained these soldiers at camps like Van Dorn where brutality was standard practice, that sent them to Europe to fight fascism while maintaining Jim Crow in their own ranks, that executed them in public spectacles, designed to intimidate other black soldiers into accepting their place, that buried them in hidden graves marked only with numbers, that lied to their families for decades. The liberation of France was real. American soldiers, including black soldiers who fought despite everything, helped free Europe from Nazi occupation. That's important. That matters. But liberation is messy and complicated, and occupying powers bring their own injustices with them. The same army that fought for freedom in Europe maintained a rigidly segregated system that denied basic dignity to black soldiers. The same army that defeated the Nazis in France hanged black soldiers at 10 times the rate of white soldiers for similar crimes. James Hendricks died on November 24, 1944. He was 21 years old. He made a terrible choice that August night, fueled by alcohol and poor judgment, and it cost Victor Bignon his life. That's a tragedy. But what happened afterward? The way the system processed his crime and delivered his punishment while letting white officers walk free, that's a different kind of tragedy. That's the machinery of racism operating with maximum efficiency. Louis Guillou wrote his novel OK Joe because he couldn't forget, because he'd watched American officers he'd come to like and respect administer 2 completely different versions of justice in the same courtroom, because he understood that what he'd witnessed wasn't accidental. It was systematic. It was American Jim Crow exported to France and administered through military courts. The French witnesses who saw these executions understood it too. They'd just been liberated from Nazi occupation. They welcomed the American soldiers as heroes. And then they watched as the same army hanged black soldiers in their town squares while white officers went free. They recognized injustice even if they couldn't fully understand its American context. That Graves registration sergeant who called it old KKK procedure had the context. He'd seen enough American history to recognize a lynching, even when it was dressed up in military protocol and legal paperwork. Legal lynching. That's exactly what it was. The numbers don't lie. 79%. In an army that was 8.5% black. Those numbers represent 55 human beings, 55 James Hendricks, 55 families who got telegrams about willful misconduct, 55 graves marked only with numbers in a cemetery that nobody talks about. And the worst part? The absolute worst part? This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a few bad apples or isolated incidents. This was policy. This was how the system was designed to work. Command influence ensured aggressive prosecution. Segregation ensured all white tribunals. Inexperienced defense attorneys ensured inadequate representation. And the culture of Jim Crow ensured that nobody questioned why almost every condemned face was black. Except Louis Guillou questioned it. He wrote about it. And 60 years later, Alice Kaplan followed his trail and brought these stories back to light. She tracked down Janine Bignon, who said no American had visited since 1944. She tracked down Hendrix's family, who never knew what happened. She pieced together the truth from trial transcripts and execution records and interviews with survivors. But here's what really stays with you. After all the research and documentation and statistical analysis, after proving beyond any doubt that the military justice system in World War II was deeply, systemically racist, nothing changed for the men in Plot E. Their graves are still numbered stones. Their families still received no apology. The army still calls them the dishonorable dead. James Hendricks is still buried under a stone marked 73. His family still had to learn the truth from a historian, not from the institution that executed him. Louis Till is still grave 56, and his son's murderers still used his father's execution to justify their lynching. The 55 black soldiers executed in Europe are still statistics that nobody wants to talk about. Because acknowledging what happened in those courtrooms in France means acknowledging something much bigger. It means acknowledging that America fought World War II with one set of rules for white soldiers and another for black ones. It means acknowledging that the greatest generation perpetuated Jim Crow even as they defeated the Nazis. It means acknowledging that liberation was complicated and messy, and that occupying armies bring their own injustices. It means acknowledging that James Hendricks, guilty as he was, deserved better than a rigged system, a public hanging, and a numbered grave that his family couldn't even find. The liberation of France happened 79 years ago, but the men in Plot E are still there, still hidden in the trees, still marked only with numbers, still waiting for someone to acknowledge what really happened, still waiting for justice.